Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on maximizing PNBOT for current users. My name is Serena Phillips, and I am a project manager and PNBOT developer at the Institute for Patient-Centered Initiatives and Health Equity at the GW Cancer Center. So for those of you who have interacted with us in the past, we used to be called the GW Cancer Institute, but we recently had a name change, so don't be confused, you're in the right place. Before we get started, I would like to take a few minutes to go over some housekeeping remarks. Today's program is being recorded. We will keep all phones muted throughout the duration of today's webinar to avoid background noise and disruption. However, we definitely want to hear from you, so please use the bottom left pod that says chat with GW/ask a question to privately chat with us. So if at any point during today's webinar you have questions or want me to redemo something that I went through too quickly or have a technical issue, use this chat pod to let us know. I have in the room with me today Sarah, Hema, and Yuki, who will be monitoring the chat pod in order to see what's going on your end, to aggregate your questions if there are similar questions, and ask them on your behalf. And we pause for Q&A after each major topic that we cover. And you'll also notice on the bottom right of your screen, there's a pod that's called Files. And from the Files pod, you can actually download the slides for today's presentation to follow along. Because I will actually be sharing my screen at some point, so the slides will get really, really small. So if you want to follow along separately on a PDF file, you can do that as well. And I'm going to move on to our agenda today, which is pretty packed. So I just want to note that the webinar is going to be 75 minutes long, so longer than our traditional 1-hour webinar, and it's scheduled to end at 3:15 p.m. Eastern. So according to your registration form submissions, these were the major topics that sort of came up that you all were interested in learning about. So I'll try to at least hit on all of them to some degree. It won't be possible to cover them all in great detail, but I'll do my best. And I'll also point you to some additional resources to learn more if you're interested in any particular topic. I should note that today's webinar is not meant to be a basic crash course or a super comprehensive tutorial. So I'll be demoing some basic functions, but my focus will really be on some of PNBOT's more advanced tasks today. If you'd like to learn more about the basics in a more thorough and slower pace, for example, how to enroll a new patient using PNBOT or how to enter an encounter, I highly recommend that you also check out the tutorial videos on the PNBOT website. So after a quick tour of the website, I plan to cover PNBOT fundamentals, how to customize PNBOT and tailor it to your specific needs, how to set up some follow-up reminders, run reports and troubleshoot common issues, and go over some miscellaneous frequently asked questions to try to avoid some of the more common pitfalls and address the issue of sharing PNBOT among multiple staff. It looks like the folks in the audience today range from brand new users to navigators who already have over a month's worth of experience using PNBOT. So some of you may feel like some of the topics are maybe a little basic and others might feel a little lost at times, but there'll be something for everyone at all levels, and you'll also receive a link to the recording of this webinar if you'd like to revisit anything at a later date. Okay, so first I just wanted to tour for you the website. So the URL is over here on your screen. I'm going to just bring it up real quick. And you all may be familiar with it already because this is where you can download the barriers tool. I'm going to share my screen, and please let us know in a minute if you are unable to see my screen. And I just also want to note that you'll see in the top right corner of the share pod 4 arrows pointing outwards, and you can always click that to make your screen full screen if the pod is too small. And then click it again to go back to the general webinar view in order to see the other pods, like if you want to ask us a question or see the slides or download the files. So this is what the Barriers Tool website looks like. You can download the most current version of PNBOT from here. We're currently on version 1.1. You can also use the button here to provide feedback or report any issues. Here are links to the various training videos that I just referenced. I don't advise that you click on them right now because it'll open up another instance of Adobe Connect, which you probably don't want to do at the moment. But later on, I definitely recommend that you check these out. And then there are a number of frequently asked questions that you can peruse and some disclaimers and legal information. Okay, so I'm going to just go back to the slides again. And then we're going to start with some fundamentals. Just to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page and understand what PNBOT is and who can use it and have a solid understanding of the PNBOT data structure and parts. Okay, so for anyone hearing about PNBOT for the first time, PNBOT stands for Patient Navigation Barriers and Outcomes Tool. It's basically a Microsoft Excel document, so it should be similar to other Excel documents that you're familiar with, except that it's macro-enabled. So it uses the file extension .xlsm as opposed to XLS or XLSX, and it has some programming on the back end that allows it to do some fancy stuff. So as you saw, it's available on our website for free. After taking a short survey, there's no subscription fee or contract for any nonprofit use. PNBOT is an evidence and practice-informed data management tool that navigation programs can use to enter and track information about their patients and navigation work. So it's almost like a very simple electronic health record system tailored for navigation in an Excel spreadsheet, if you can imagine that. So navigation programs basically told us that a lot of times, even though they spend a lot of time entering data and documenting information they need, they have trouble pulling it in a meaningful way that allows them to generate reports that they need to include, you know, for example, in a funder report or some kind of report to an administrator to justify resources towards their navigation program. So that's sort of the need that PNBOT is designed to address. It basically takes the data that you enter into it and uses that data to generate a wide variety of reports that you can select from and, you know, use it for whatever purposes you may have. Okay, so who can use PNBOT? To start with the technical aspects, to use PNBOT, you must be using a PC and a Windows operating system. It is unfortunately not compatible with Macs or Google Sheets, and we haven't tested it with other, you know, mobile or other platforms. So you also need to be running a relatively current version of Microsoft Excel. It should work fine for versions 2010 and later because we used 2010 through 2016 to develop PNBOT. It could possibly work for 2007. We haven't tested that ourselves firsthand, but it should work. However, any Excel version over 10 years old will probably run into compatibility issues. PNBOT is not a huge file. It's about 1.8 megabytes. It might take a little bit longer to open. The file size may grow as you add more entries, but it's really not a big file to be concerned about space for the most part. As far as the PNBOT contexts that are appropriate for its use, we really try to make PNBOT super duper flexible because we understand just how diverse patient navigation programs can be. You know, we know that you navigate all the way from screening and outreach through end of life, and you may navigate different types of cancer. Some of you may have nursing licenses or no licenses or be social workers, and we try to take all that into consideration and allow you to tailor it in order to make it most relevant to your specific context. It is, however, designed for cancer navigation programs, so it may not be the best fit for other types of navigation. But other than that, you should be able to use PNBOT, and I'll be going over ways to customize it in just a minute. And I should note, some of you were curious about screening. I'll actually be highlighting ways that you can tailor PNBOT for screening purposes as well, in cases where you aren't working directly with folks who already have a cancer diagnosis. Okay, so I want to pause for a moment to go over the major types of data that PNBOT collects, because this is super fundamental and important to know about. PNBOT can collect patient data, case data, encounters data, and testimonials data. And get familiar with these colors because they're color-coded in PNBOT to try to orient you a little bit. So red for patient, green for case, blue for encounter, there's actually a purple color for barriers, and orange-yellow for testimonials. I should also note that after this webinar, when we follow up with you via email, we'll also be sending you all we'll be sending you all a quick start user's guide that you can peruse for additional information if you want to learn more about this in greater detail. Okay, so following the triangles here, that sort of gives you an idea of the hierarchy of the data and the flow of data entry. So just to go over what each level means, the patient level of data refers to anything that has to do with the patient as a human being, as a unique person. So at the patient level, PNBot can collect information about name, date of birth, insurance, language, any sort of demographic variable. There's intake date, which is the first time a patient interacts with the navigation program, and also the client ID gets assigned at this level, which is the unique number assigned for the patient so that PNBot knows who you're talking about. And then the next level is the case level. So examples of case level variables are things like cancer type, current stage, case start date, case close date, other dates, medical team information, and all the information that has to do with this particular case or episode of cancer. So we realize that each navigation program is different. You might define a case differently, and we don't really try to impose that. We very loosely mean case to mean when navigation services start to when they stop, and that will probably correspond with a cancer episode for most of you who navigate through treatment. And the reason why we separate patient from case is that, there are scenarios where a patient may have more than one case, like for example, if they have multiple episodes of cancer or occurrences, and you don't want to necessarily write over the old case information with the new case information. You want to be able to maintain all that historic information separately. So this data structure allows you to have one patient record, because everyone needs one and only one patient record in PNBot, and then at least one case, but possibly more than one case depending on the patient scenario. And then the next level of data is the encounter. So what we mean by encounter is each time a navigator interacts with a patient or provides services on behalf of a patient. So encounter level variables include things like the date that the encounter happened, the encounter type, or whether you met with them in person or you called them on the phone, outcomes, minutes spent on the encounter, barriers that you've identified, and things that you've done to address those barriers. And then lastly, there's testimonials information, which is basically anything qualitative in nature. So stories and quotes from patients, because a lot of the reports that PNBot includes are quantitative in nature, but we all know how important the patient voice is and how powerful a quote can be in really demonstrating the value of navigation services. So you have the option to capture that as well in PNBot. So going back to the triangles, anytime you enroll a brand new patient, you always want to start with a patient record. You can't start at the case, encounter, or testimonials level because you'll be prompted to first specify who you're talking about before you can enter anything else. So for example, if I tried to start by entering information about cancer type, PNBot would want to know, well, who's the person that you're referring to that has cancer? Or if I started with encounter, they would want to know, who is this encounter for? So enrolling a brand new patient, I'd always make one patient record and then follow that up by entering a case, and then follow that up by entering as many encounters as is appropriate. So if I meet with a patient 5 times throughout the course of navigation, they'll have 5 encounter records, and it sort of goes in that flow. So to have an encounter, I need a case. To have a case, I need a patient record, and to have a testimonials record, I need a patient at least. That's not really tied to case or encounter. Okay, so just to give you a concrete example, let's say we have a patient, Mr. Jones. We start with creating a patient record for him. If any of his information changes, that's fine. We can just update the record, but he only ever has one patient record. In 2014, he has an episode of prostate cancer and needs navigation services. So he has this first case the navigation program created. And then related to that 2014 episode of prostate cancer, maybe the navigator met with him 3 different times, generating 3 encounter records. And then after that, perhaps his cancer was resolved, he was okay, he didn't need anything else from the navigation program, and they lost contact. So this case was closed. Unfortunately, in 2017, he got diagnosed with recurrence. So in that scenario, the navigator opened a second case for him, and then related to the second case, the navigator called or met with him 2 more times, generating 2 encounter records related to the 2017 case. And at some point, we're not sure when, he might have provided testimonial or correspondence that he was willing to share in support of the navigation program that's tied to his patient record and not any case. So that's generally how the data structure of PNBot works. And I just want to go over some of the parts of PNBot, and I'll be showing this to you live in a minute. But this is basically a big list of all the different sheets that are contained in PNBot. So PNBot is an Excel workbook that contains 22 sheets for 5 main purposes. So I'm just going to ignore the first category for now. But basically, the major categories of sheets you'll have are data entry sheets that you use for inputting information. They look like forms. You have list sheets, which are basically your databases of raw data that get saved from what's entered in the data entry sheets. And then you have report sheets and pivot sheets, which are actually both for reporting purposes, where you can synthesize information that's been saved into the list sheets. So the general flow is that you enter into the data entry sheets, it goes into the list sheets for storage, and then the report sheets and the pivot sheets point to the list sheets in order to generate your reports. And the reason why you have multiple sheets per type is because you have one for each level of data. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again, just to give you an idea of what that looks like. Okay, so this is my home screen, and this is what PNBot looks like the first time I open it. This is my control panel, so from here I can navigate to whatever task I need. So I'm going to click on a random button here. I just want to note that in each of the different sheets, no matter where you are, you'll usually see a little PNBot icon over here that says Home that you can always click on if you get lost, and it'll take you back. If you're ever curious which sheet you're in, you can just look at the names on the bottom here. They're sort of like little tabs that you can click on to select various sheets. So whichever one is up front and bold is the one that you're on. So the data entry sheets, that category that I wanted to cover, all those names end in the word data entry. So I have one for each level of data. So a patient data entry sheet, which I'm going to expand out, that looks like this. A case data entry sheet, encounters data entry sheet, and I actually am going to just select a random patient and click Add a New Encounter so you can see that form. And a testimonials data entry sheet, which is also one that I have to select a patient for in order to demonstrate. And then the other group of sheets following data entry are my list sheets, as I mentioned before. So all those end in the word list. And these look like the traditional spreadsheets that you might be familiar with using Excel. So again, you have one for each level of data. So this is what the patient list sheet looks like, case, encounters. There's actually an additional one for barriers history, and there's a testimonials one. So just so you know, the barriers list sheet and the encounters list sheet get populated from the encounters data entry form. So as I mentioned before, following each level of data, whatever is entered in the data entry sheets gets transferred into the list sheet. So if I'm in my encounters data entry sheet, all the information up here in the top half gets stored in my encounters list sheet. And then if I scroll down, whatever gets entered down here in my barriers and services information table gets stored in my barriers list sheet. Okay, and then moving along, I'm going to move on to the reports list sheet. So from here, you can navigate to all your report sheets and your pivot sheets. So I'm just going to scroll over here. I have my patient reports, case reports, encounter reports, and barrier reports. For the report sheets, you won't have anything for testimonials because these are all quantitative. So the ones ending the word reports will give you sort of the automatic canned reports. And then there are 4 more sheets here that are my pivot sheets that I'll go over a little bit later, but these give you additional flexibility to create your own custom reports. So that's sort of the quick and dirty, high-level rundown of what's in PNBot. I just want to pause right now since I sort of bombarded you with a lot of information to see if you have any questions. Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to proceed, and please definitely feel free to chat any questions you have as they arise. You'll see additional slides that look like this 4 more times throughout the presentation, and Yuki and Sarah and Hema will just be fielding those questions to me each time we land on one of these slides. Okay? Great. So I'm going to move on to customization. Okay, and I'm going to share my screen again over here. Okay, so how do you customize PNBot in a way that makes it as relevant as possible for your particular context? Because folks have said to us, you know, navigation programs are so different. How could you possibly build a data management system that makes sense for everybody across all the different contexts? So that's why I really tried to make it super flexible. And the first step to customization is to go to the PNBot setup sheet that you can access using this button here in the home sheet. And the setup sheet basically contains a giant list of variables at the patient level, at the case level, and at the encounters level that you can opt into or opt out of. Completely your choice, but they're included here, and we tried to be more comprehensive to accommodate a wider range of scenarios rather than less comprehensive. But if these are not relevant to you, you can just uncheck whatever variables you don't want in order to opt out of them. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like in practice, right now you see that all the variables are checked. So when I go to my data entry sheet, I have a long list of data entry fields here at each of the different levels. In the list sheet, I might also find myself scrolling over a lot because there is a column for each of those variables in each of the list sheets. So that's what it looks like with everything checked off. I'm actually going to click on Uncheck All to show you the contrast if, you know, for example, you're in a scenario where you have an electronic health record system already that you need to enter into. You don't really need to duplicate that data entry. You don't want to have to re-enter something again. It's not useful to you, and you just want to use the bare bones. And that's completely fine as well. So I could just uncheck everything, and now when I go to my data entry sheet, I see that it's a lot shorter, and there's barely anything to enter. And these are just really the bare essential variables. And same for my case and my encounters data entry sheets. And when I go to my list sheets, I also see that the number of columns included is also greatly reduced. And that's because when I check or uncheck the variables here, what it does is it shows or it hides the rows and columns corresponding with that variable in the data entry and the list sheet. So just to give us a concrete example, let's say that my navigation program just wants to capture maybe primary insurance information, have a space to write notes about insurance at the patient level, and then also catchment in order to systematically see where patients are coming from. And then at the case level, maybe I just want to know cancer type, I want to know if this is a recurrence or not, and perhaps our administrators are interested in knowing how many of our folks are enrolled in clinical trials. And for the screening folks out there who may not work with patients with a cancer diagnosis, you'll see that there are a lot of dates here to help you calculate timeliness of care. But there are some dates here for, you know, first screening imaging, date of additional screening imaging, and you can just opt into those and ignore the rest of them that aren't relevant to you. So that's an option if you just work in screening. So for example purposes, I'm just going to select, for my hypothetical program, date of completion of active treatment and date of survivorship care plan delivery. And I'll also, at the encounter level, opt into navigation staff, so who did the encounter, the amount of time the navigator spent on encounter, and date of follow-up needed, because I want to be able to use some of the follow-up features later on. Okay. So let's say that after perusing the big list of default variables that I can opt into or out of, I decide that my navigation program actually needs to capture some information that wasn't included in the list. So I can use this table here, halfway down the setup sheet, to specify my own custom variables. So to do that, I would need to know, number one, what level of variable I'm interested in, and number two, what type of variable I'm interested in. So I can specify up to 6 custom variables per level, so 6 patient, 6 case, or 6 encounters level variables, and 2 per type at each level. So text type variable would be sort of a write-in field. If I wanted a multiple choice, I could specify a list type variable, or I could specify a date type variable if that's what I'm interested in. So just as an example, let's say that my navigation program provided pantry services, which is actually part of what I did at my last job. We provided emergency food services for a cancer patient. So in that scenario, it might be really important to us to know if people had allergies. So that's sort of a patient level variable. The person has an allergy, so I'm going to check patient text variable number 1 to activate and opt into this variable. And the reason why I chose a text type variable is because there are so many different allergies out there, I can't really do that as a multiple choice. I want to be able to write that in. So I can use the second column here to rename the variable from the default patient text variable number 1 name to allergies. And as another example, let's say that at the encounters level, I want to be able to specify the status of my follow-up. Because remember up here, I opted into this variable data follow-up needed. And in addition to being able to, keep track of when I do follow-up, I want to be able to keep track of the status of the follow-up, whether I did it or not. That's not included in PNBot, but I can make that variable myself by opting into encounters list variable number 1. And the reason why I'm choosing list is because I think I have in mind 4 different status options that I just want to be able to select from a drop-down so I don't write it in every single time. So I'm going to name this variable follow-up status. And going across the same row, I can specify up to 5 things that I want to appear in the drop-down for this variable. So I'm going to put in pending, for example, if I didn't do the follow-up yet, I can put in completed if I did it, maybe unable to contact if I tried to reach out but couldn't get a hold of the patient, and no longer needed if, my original reason for follow-up is sort of obsolete now. And you could sort of make up your own. This is just an example. And that's basically how customization works. So I'm totally done with my setup. I would just save this file, and if working across multiple navigators, I would of course want to make sure that things are set up the same way for everyone so that data gets collected consistently for all navigators. So I just want to walk through a concrete example of what things look like now that we've customized PNBot to our particular needs. So let's say we're enrolling a brand new patient in PNBot. So I'm going to start with patient level data entry in the patient data entry sheet. Just as an aside, I can also get to it using this button here from the home screen. I'm going to generate a client ID number. You could also make up your own if you prefer. I'm going to type in a name, a date of birth, and then the navigation date is set to today by default, but from this little calendar widget, I can specify something different. So maybe I'm back entering data. I'm a little behind in data entry, and the intake actually happened September 26th. So I can just click that here. And I should also note that it's also okay to click on the weekend dates. And then I see here the variables that I opted into in the setup sheet. So I can specify primary insurance from this dropdown because it's a structured list type variable. So maybe it's uninsured. I can write some notes to myself, like, for example, uninsured as of the 26th, but has a Medicaid application pending, or whatever the notes might be that are useful to you. Maybe my navigation program wants to track catchment area by zip code, so I could just type in whatever zip code. And here I see the custom variable that I specified for myself earlier for allergies. And I don't really have a choice of where in the form it shows up. All the custom variables will show up together in a designated spot, but here's the field, and I can write in whatever I want. So maybe she has, let's say, a peanut allergy. And then the age gets calculated automatically, and the rest of the gray boxes I don't really need to worry about. They get filled out automatically without anything from me. So I'm just going to click on Save and Continue to Case Data Entry. I get the prompt that the save is successful, and then I'm going to move on to Case Data Entry. And case data entry, when you enroll a brand new patient, I should just note, should happen as the second step for data entry and immediately after you fill out a patient data entry form. So you can almost think of it as page 1 and page 2 of an intake, just to complete right away for any new patient. It copied over a lot of information that I had entered in the previous form, so I don't need to enter it again. The case start date defaults to the intake date from the previous sheet. I don't want to specify a case close date because I'm not closing the case yet. I'm just opening it. And then here are the variables that I opted into in the setup sheet. So I can choose a cancer type. And again, for those of you who are working with folks that don't have a cancer diagnosis or a mixed group of people, you do have the option to specify no cancer here. I just want to note that. But for now, I'll just choose a random other cancer. Maybe this is not recurrent, so I'll select no. Enrolled in clinical trial, I'll select yes if that's the case. And I can specify some dates here as well. So date of completion of active treatment, I'm just making this up. These dates may not make sense. Let's say it was the 15th and she had a survivorship care plan delivered the 16th. And then I always want to hit the save buttons here to make sure that all the information makes it from the data entry sheet into the list sheet. So using the navigation buttons at the top of the data entry sheets, I can always confirm if I'm ever not sure that my information saved by looking at the corresponding list sheet. So if I go to see full list of cases, for example, I see that my case entry that I just put in for Sarah Manning is over here. And if I go over to the patient list, since I just did one of those forms, I see Sarah Manning here. So that all worked out great. So moving on, we also made a custom variable for the encounters level. So I'm going to enter an encounters data entry form, and I always want to clear out any other patient's information I might see in there, and I always want to select the patient from this drop-down. So I'm going to click on Sarah Manning, and I want to select one of these two radio buttons. So in this case, add a new encounter. You always want to click it, even if it's already selected before. You always want to make sure to click it to sort of start with a new form. Again, I see fields that are already filled out with information that I don't need to fill out myself. The encounter date defaults to today, but I can, again, if I'm back entering data, I can select a different date. So maybe this is for the 26th. My encounter type, maybe we met in person. For navigation staff, that's me. I'll type in my name. And I can also choose how long the encounter took. So let's say it took 15 minutes. And then if I want to remind myself of follow-up, I want to make sure to fill out this form, this field, data follow-up, which I opted into in the setup sheet. So clicking there, maybe I want the follow-up to take place October 4th. So this calendar sort of spills into the next month, so I could just click it here. But if I wanted to, I could choose the month and the year from the drop-downs here in the calendar widget. Okay, and for now, my follow-up status is pending. So this is the custom variable that I created using the table in the setup sheet. And just focusing on what happened today during this encounter, or on the 26th during that encounter, I could use this button to add some outcomes. So maybe I helped improve timeliness of care, whatever the case may be. And I addressed the barrier of care coordination, coordinating appointments. Let's say that was a barrier. I click OK, and my action was that I helped to schedule an appointment. Maybe we sat down together to schedule an appointment for blood work. And then my follow-up for that is going to be October 4th. And I can use the general notes field not only to maybe summarize in a narrative way what happened during this encounter, but also specify any sort of reminders that I want for myself that I want to be able to see when I look at the follow-up. So I could, for example, just say something like, met with Sarah, scheduled blood work with Blood Work Lab Inc. at whatever phone number. Appointment is going to take place on October 5th. Call Sarah on the 4th to remind her and make sure she understands instructions. Okay, great. So I'm going to save the encounter and hit OK. So that's basically it in terms of how customizations work, but I sort of started teaching you about how to use the follow-up function, so I'm just going to go through with that and just show you real quick how you can actually look up the reminder that you just put in for yourself. So let's go back to the home screen. You'll see over here there's a section called See Follow-up Needed with these two buttons to look at follow-up today and to look at all upcoming follow-up. So this has nothing to do with customizations now. I just want to show you this feature. If I clicked on follow-up today, what that button would do is it would take me to the encounters list, and it would filter all the entries to only those with an encounter follow-up date that equals today, or September 28th. There isn't any, so that's why this is blank. And then I would want to use one of these two buttons to go back to either the data entry form or the home screen and also unfilter this sheet. So I'm going to click on the home button, and let's actually try the other button, all upcoming follow-up. What that button does is it jumps me also to the encounters list sheet, but it filters so that you only see entries where the encounter date of follow-up is today or later. And then you can also sort by the date of follow-up if you want to see it in chronological order, so you can sort of have a to-do list for yourself over here. So now I see all the follow-up schedules, starting from September 30th throughout, and here's actually the one that I just entered for Sarah Manning. So now when I go to the sheet and I see, oh, I need to follow up with her by October 4th, what happened and what do I need to do, I can now remember that what I need to do on the 4th is to remind Sarah of her blood work appointment and make sure she understands the instructions. And you'll recall that we also added that custom variable checking on the status of the follow-up. So, that says pending here, but this is one way that I can sort of eyeball, if I wanted to, the dates that I need to do follow-up, what I needed to do, and the status of all that follow-up to keep track for myself. And just a quick note, that all the column headers over here sort of reflect the names of the variables in a logical way, but up here, this column name still says encounters list number 1. So even though you sort of change the name of the variable when you make up your own, the name of the custom variable in any of the list sheets won't change. So it still says encounter list number 1. The same will happen in the reports, which I'll go over in a little bit. So it's just important to remember what you're using each column for. And you can always map it back in the setup sheet. So encounters list number 1, I see all these values of pending. I know it's that variable for follow-up. And if I go to my setup sheet and refer back to my table, I can see, indeed, encounters list variable number 1 is the follow-up status. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for some additional questions if you have any. We had one question come in, but I think you're going to address it later regarding how do they control the client ID field if they have multiple sites using the tool, and if you have to aggregate the data from the sites into sheets from other sites or from the entire state. Okay, so that's a great question. I definitely will cover sharing later on, but I'd be happy to just quickly comment on that right now. So we're actually going to go through a flow sheet to explain different scenarios where sharing a PNBot sheet amongst multiple navigators might make sense versus using individual copies. But if you're in a scenario where you're using multiple copies of PNBot, you have a few different options for aggregating reports if that's something that you want to do. So you can either just take all the different copies of PNBot, and if you want to aggregate reports across navigators, you can sort of generate all the different reports individually in each copy of PNBot and then just add up the numbers if it makes sense to do so, outside of PNBot, which is sort of some manual work. Another option, if you want to actually combine all of the raw data, you can generate one big aggregate report for all that data by copying all of the raw data from each copy of PNBot into a blank copy of PNBot. So generally, I'll recommend that when you download PNBot, just reserve one copy of PNBot to be blank that you can go to in case you screw up your working copy or for reporting purposes or what have you, so that you don't have to go through the entire registration form and re-download everything. Anyway, so that's basically what you would need to do, and I can actually demo that for you if you'd like with a couple examples. So let me go ahead and share my screen again so I can show you a super duper simple example. So the mechanics of how it would work to sort of combine the reports is you'd want to open up all the different copies of PNBot. So now I have 3 instances of Excel open. I have my first navigator's PNBot open here. I have my second navigator's copy of PNBot that she's been sort of independently maintaining. And then I have a completely blank copy that is 100% not intended for data entry purposes. It's only meant for aggregating data and generating big aggregate reports. So what I would do is I'd take my first navigator's PNBot copy, and I'll just start with a super simple example here. So let's say that I just wanted to generate one big aggregate report for encounters. I would open that first PNBot copy, and I would just copy all the data. So to do that, well, first I'm going to ignore first example and second example patient and start from row 5. So I'm going to move my cursor all the way to the left where I see the row number. And my cursor looks like a right pointing black arrow, and I'm going to click and drag down all the way to my last entry. And once that's all highlighted, I'm going to copy it by pressing Control-C. And then I'm going to paste it into that blank copy just for report aggregation purposes. So I'm going to go to Encounters List there. And in this case, this requires unprotecting the sheet to paste into it. So I need to go to my Review tab, click on Unprotect Sheet. The password to unprotect any list sheet is GW Cancer, all lowercase. And now I'm going to go to my next free row, which is row 5, and press Control-V to paste. And basically, hold on a second, let me try that again. Okay, and I see all that information is pasted down here. So now my blank copy has the raw data for one navigator's copy of PNBot. I want to put in my second navigator's data from her copy of PNBot. So going to the second PNBot navigator encounters list, I only see 2 entries here just for example purposes. So I'm going to select the 2 encounters here. Again, ignoring first example patient and second example patient. I highlighted them in the same way. I'm copying by pressing Control-C, going back to my blank copy, going down to the very end to the next spot that I see that's free, which is in row 56 in this instance. I'm going to click in that blank cell and paste. Okay, so now I basically have both navigators' data pasted in this blank copy of PNBot. Now what I need to do is to make sure that all the data that I just pasted is included in the table here. So if I click in any of the header columns over here, I'll see it says Table Tools and Design. So I'm going to click on the Design tab, and what I want to do is resize the table. Because right now, so if I click on that, it'll tell me that the range is only up to row 4, which means that anything under row 4 is not going to show up in any of my reports. So I need to resize the table. So I can tell that my data goes up to row 57. So you can sort of ignore this if that looks scary, but basically I just want to change that very last number at the end there from a 4 to 57. And I click OK. And now you can sort of tell by the formatting even that the size of my table has expanded to include all that new data. So just to show you what it looks like now in terms of aggregate reports, I'm going to go to my home screen and try to run a report. And then since we're just working with the encounters level example, I'm going to go to encounter reports to see what that looks like. And I always want to click on calculate refresh after selecting a year. So I don't have data for anything other than 2016. So I'm going to leave that alone, but I want to click on calculate refresh. And when I do that, my numbers update and reflect the data that was included in both of my Navigator's PNBOT copies. So just as an aside, it's important to note that you might need to do some renumbering in each of the different copies of PNBOT to make sure that the ID numbers assigned aren't redundant. So for example, with client ID, if you're using the auto numbering, what PNBOT does is just add one more to the biggest number. So you don't want to end up with a whole lot of patients with an ID number 10,001 or with a case ID number of 1 or an encounter ID number of 1, because it's all going to start at that same basic level. So if you are using multiple copies of PNBOT and you don't want that redundant overlapping numbering, it's super simple. You just need to make sure that in whatever sheet navigators are using to enter their data, before data entry starts, just make a different range for the patient, or sorry, for the navigator. So in patient list, I can re-specify the range by going into list sheet and changing the ID number. In this case, I change it to 20,000 so that when I enter data, I can click on Get New Client ID, and it starts auto-numbering from 20,000 instead of 10,000 as an example. And I can do the same thing for other ID numbers that are sort of automatic. So case ID that automatically starts 1, 2, 3, I can use that for navigator number 1, but for my second navigator, if I don't want those numbers to start from 1, I can just go to my first example patient and change this number to something like 10,000 or 20,000 so that those ranges don't overlap. So that's how the mechanics of sharing works in a nutshell. I kind of went out of order there a little bit, but yeah.
So we had another question come in
Sure.
about when you do custom variables, are they updated in the sheets view to show the names that you assign them? Can you give us a little tour of that?
Yes, definitely. So that's a great question. When you assign, sorry, let me just get out of some of these extra copies of PNBOT. When you specify a specific name for a custom variable, it will update in the data entry sheets only. So it won't update in the list type sheets or any report sheets. And that's because Excel is sort of protective over the names of the columns here, and it's best not to really mess with it. So they'll keep their default names like patient text number 1 or encounters list number 2 or whatever the case may be. So just to show you again real quick, my table here has the name allergies for patient text variable number 1. I renamed it. In my patient data entry sheet, for that field, it says allergies, just as I specified. But if I go to the patient list sheet, I see that the column is unhidden for that, And this is the column that corresponds with patient text variable number 1, and I see my entry of peanut, so it's clearly an allergy. But this name won't change. And later on, if I work with reporting, the variable list is also going to be specified as patient text number 1 rather than allergy. That's a good question.
Great, thanks. And Serena, since we did get a little bit down into the questions about how to share PNBot, another question did come in that I hope we'll circle back to later about whether you can have one version of PNBot on a shared computer with multiple navigators entering into the same PNBot. So perhaps we can pick that up when we get into the sharing slide, or we can address that now.
Okay. I don't mind going out of order as well. So let's actually skip ahead since that seems like a popular topic. So sharing PNBot. So this is sort of a moot point if you're the only navigator, but really commonly we have navigation programs that might have 2 or 5 or however many navigators on staff. So this is sort of an algorithm that you can use to decide what makes the most sense for you. So you guys correctly identified the 2 options that you have. Number 1, all navigators can enter into the same copy of PNBot. Or number 2, each navigator maintains their own copy of PNBot that they just enter into themselves, and later on, if you want to, you can combine them, or you don't have to. So to figure out which of these 2 options works the best for you, the first question to ask is whether it's possible to share. Is that even on the table? So do navigators in your program have access to the same file locations? If you have like a shared server folder, or if you all share the same computer workstation, then the answer to that might be yes. Otherwise, if maybe one navigator is in a breast clinic and another navigator is in a separate hospital and you have no way of sharing the files, that's sort of not even an option to you to share the same copy of PNBot. Then you'd have to definitely go with option 2, where each navigator maintains their own individual copy of PNBot. So assuming that you can share the file, the next question to ask is whether navigators need to be in PNBot at the same time, entering data or looking up data at the same time. So let's take a scenario where maybe I have a program where one navigator only comes in Mondays and Tuesdays, and another navigator only comes in Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and they sit at the same desk, so they can access the file in the same place. Then it's completely feasible to use the same copy of PNBot. They don't need to be in there at the same time. They're not even there the same days, so there's no problem. However, if you have navigators that are seeing patients at the same time and entering data at the same time, only one person can make changes to the file at the same time. So you all may be familiar with this if you have a shared drive at your office or clinical setting and have Word documents or Excel documents. If one person has it open, anybody else who tries to open it will probably get prompted with a message that says something like, this is read-only, so-and-so has it open, you can't save changes to it. So that might be annoying if you have multiple people trying to save edits at the same time. So basically, if you all must be in there at the same time, again, option 2 might be the better option, where you just each have your own copy so you don't get frustrated with one another, unless you can work out a system where you're entering data at different times during the day or whatever the case may be. So assuming that it is feasible to choose option 1, where all navigators enter into a single copy of PNBot, you have another battery of questions to try to figure out what would best suit your needs. So the next question to ask would be, do navigators in your program see the same set of patients or a different set of patients? If your navigators see the same set of patients, then it would actually be really helpful to be able to see what another navigator did with a patient that you're seeing now, or if you're sort of sending patients to each other and need to all be on the same page with what's going on with that patient, then it's probably best to share a single copy of PNBot, where that information sharing is a little bit more seamless. However, if maybe I have a breast navigator and then I have a lung navigator and we never have overlapping patients, there's no reason why I, as a breast navigator, need to see my colleagues' lung patients, then maybe it's not super important. And then the next question to ask in that scenario would be whether we care about aggregating reports across navigators. So if I'm fine just generating breast reports and she's fine with generating lung reports and we don't need to combine them, then there's no reason why we shouldn't just have separate copies of PNBOT. But if we do want aggregate reports, then it might make sense to enter into the same copy of PNBOT, or we can do what I just demoed, where you sort of maintain separate copies and then combine them at the end. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, so I'm just going to move on to reports, which we sort of started touching on. And basically, I just wanted to demo for you, I'm going to go backwards a little bit. So let's start with the more difficult kind of report, which is the pivot report. So just sharing my screen. So from the home screen, to get to any reports, I'm going to click on Reports List, which lists out all the canned reports that get generated for you automatically. And it's organized by, again, the level of data. So patient, case, encounter, and barriers. And each level has two buttons here, one that will take me to the automatic reports and one that will take me to the pivot sheets or the pivot reports. So if you created any custom variables, you can only use the pivot reports for those custom variables to generate reports. To give you an example of that, let's go to the encounter and outcomes reports, build your own encounter reports. So clicking on that will take me to the encounters pivot sheet, which is sort of a blank sheet over here. To use this, I would click somewhere in the pivot table, and that would bring up on the right here a list of all the variables in the encounters list, because this is an encounters level report. And I would have the option to drag any of these variables into one of four areas. So filters, columns, rows, and values. So for example, maybe I want to see how many encounters have what status of follow-up. So I would take my encounter ID variable to get a count of encounters. For some reason that defaulted to some. By clicking on a little downward pointing arrow where it says sum of encounters, I can choose value field settings and change between sum, count, average, or whatever I want my statistic to be. So I want it to be count. I want to count the number of encounters. So I'm going to click OK. So I drag that to the value section. And then my custom variable that I made was an encounter list type variable. So let's drag that to rows. And then I always want to click a refresh button anytime I have the option to when working with reports. And that refreshes the report to reflect the most current data. So now for my custom variable, I can see that I had 23 encounters where the follow-up that I specified was completed, 4 was no longer needed, so on and so forth. And just as an aside, for any sort of report that I generate in PNBOT, any editing that I want to do to it, I want to do outside of PNBOT, because really these are templates, so you don't want to make a lot of edits and then the next time you use it, it'll get sort of written over. You don't want to really mess with the template a whole lot. So if I wanted to use this for whatever reason in a report, I can just copy this table, again highlighting it and then pressing Control-C, and I can paste this in a Word document where I can, go ahead and edit it as I see fit. Okay, so pivot tables can also give you the flexibility to generate some more sophisticated reports. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like, I'm going to go to Case Pivot. And let's take a look. I'm again going to click in the pivot area. And let's say that I wanted to count the number of cases. So I'm going to drag case ID to the value section here. I wanted to count them by whether they're in a clinical trial or not, because maybe that's important to our administrators. And I want to see whether there's sort of a difference in who's participating in clinical trials by recurrent status. So I can cross-tab that. I drag clinical trials to rows. Now I'm going to drag the variable recurrence to columns, and I'm going to click refresh. And now I can see what that looks like in a cross-tabs fashion. Another thing that I could do is I can filter. So maybe I only want to see that information for my breast cancer patients. So I'll drag my cancer type variable to the filters area, and it shows up here. Currently it says cancer type all, but if I click on the drop down, I can just select breast cancer and click OK, and the numbers will update for me. Okay? And that's basically how pivot tables work. You have the flexibility to play around on your own and arrange the variables as you'd like. But now I just want to show you what some of the canned reports look like. So I'm going to go to the Encounter Reports page by clicking on this button here. And as I mentioned before, you always want to click Calculate Refresh when working with reports. But these are sort of the structured reports that get automatically calculated for you if you entered information for that variable. So again, you know, the templates are here regardless of whether you opt into or out of variables, but you'll see no data if no data was collected for that particular report. So here I can see, you know, the total number of encounters that my navigation program conducted, the number of encounters by type, so how many were phone calls or in person, etc. Some summary statistics of the number of minutes spent on average per encounter for each month, and the longest and shortest and total. I can generate a report about outcomes achieved, which might look good for some of the reports administrators or to funders showing what our navigators have been capable of doing through working with our patients, such as you know, avoiding unplanned hospital admissions or improving patient adherence, et cetera. And then at the bottom of the sheet, and actually at the bottom of several of the report sheets, you'll see these special reports that have their own sets of buttons here, but otherwise look blank. And these reports are reports that count text type variables that are write-in fields or variables that have a long list of drop-down options. So I'm going to click the Calculate Refresh button specific to total number of encounters by navigator. And then I always, at the same time, I always want to still click the Calculate Refresh button up top. And what that does is it makes a new column for every single unique thing that someone typed into the field navigator. So I see that I have 6 columns here, which have navigator names in them, and I can see how many encounters each navigator did for each of these months. Now, I deliberately made some data entry errors here. So this raises an important training issue, which is that our navigators haven't been entering their names consistently, which makes it look like we have 6 navigators and have accounts separately when really we only have 3, Serena, Rohini, and Angela. So how do we fix this? We can go to where the data is stored. So since it's an encounter report, it points to the data saved in the encounters list sheet. So now what I can do is, you know, I know that the problem has to do with the navigation staff column here where we store the navigator names. And I can actually click on this little downward pointing triangle to see all the unique responses. And I can see that there are 6 of them here. So let's decide that everyone just needs to enter their full name. So to correct the incorrect ones, such as, you know, there's Angela and Angie, I wanted to say Angela Moss. I'm going to deselect everything else and just check off those 2 and click on OK. And then normally, I definitely don't recommend entering data straight into the list sheet. You always want to enter data into the data entry sheets when you're entering new information. But to make some edits, sometimes it's okay to do it here if you're super duper careful. So I'm going to type in Angela Moss to make that correction. And I can move my cursor to the bottom right corner here and drag it down for the rest of the incorrect options. I'm going to click on this downward facing triangle filter again, and I can do the same for Serena. So I want to change all entries of Serena to Serena Phillips. And I can do that here as well. Again, I'm going to drag it down, so this way I can change the information for a lot of entries at once without manually entering it each time. Anytime I do any filtering, though, I always want to make sure to clear the filters so that folks don't get confused later about why there are only 3 entries showing and where did the rest of my data go. So just generally speaking, it's a good practice to clear the filter. Okay, so now Let's see if that worked. Let's go back to our encounters report sheet where we saw this issue. I'm again going to click on Calculate Refresh, and this one up here, and I see that now I've sort of fixed my issue. There are correctly now 3 navigation names listed here, and I have numbers that are organized in a more logical fashion. And there are a couple other issues I want to bring up really quickly. I won't have time to go into them in great detail, but other issues that you might need to troubleshoot are discrepant counts. So I made a couple entry errors on purpose here in this patient report sheet where I expected to have 25 patient records, but only 23 are showing up in primary insurance. And that's because in this template, we're only counting primary insurance of Medicaid, Medicaid HMOs, Medicare, private insurance, uninsured, or other. So one major reason if you're seeing discrepant numbers for why you might see a lower number than you might expect is if somebody makes a typo. So just to show you what that looks like very, very briefly, if I go to the patient data entry sheet for primary insurance, I should have only, been able to select from one of these 6 options, and all those responsive would have been captured in the report. But if I did what I just said was super not recommended, and I directly entered my information into the primary insurance, I could have entered something other than what was in those drop-down lists. So troubleshooting similarly to the previous example where I go to my primary insurance column, I can again click on this downward pointing triangle to see the unique list of options to try to get a sense of where the error could have happened, why I'm missing 2 entries. So I see here that someone misspelled Medicaid and somebody wrote they don't have insurance, which should have been Medicaid with 1D, which I can correct straight from here. And instead of they don't have insurance, they should have said uninsured. And that's sort of the pitfalls of, entering straight into the list sheet is that you have typos like that when you have structured fields. Because the typos won't get captured into some of the structured reports. Again, I'm going to clear this filter. And then let's see what it looks like now when I go to patient reports. So I have this total count here of 23. I'm going to click Calculate Refresh. And now I see that it's actually been corrected. Now the additional numbers are reflected here where they weren't previously. Okay, so one additional thing that you might need to troubleshoot, and I can't demo it for you today unfortunately, is for any sort of summary statistic. So for example, for the timeliness reports that you see in the case report sheet, at the bottom here, like number of days between various milestones in cancer care, you sometimes might see blank values when there are mistakes. So for example, for days between completion of active treatment and survivorship care plan delivery, that assumes that the date that you finish treatment is before the date that you get your survivorship care plan. So you see some blank values here, even though I should have 12, because by accident, somebody entered a survivorship care plan delivery date that was before completion of treatment. So that would need to be corrected. So just as an FYI, something to keep an eye out for is in case you see any blank values when looking at any sort of timeliness or summary statistic type of report. That could be the culprit. So that's sort of a super quick rundown of how reports work. Does anyone have questions at the moment about reports or anything else I've gone over? Okay. No other questions? Okay. Super. So in that case, I'm going to move on to some tips that I just want you to be aware of before we close. So we've gotten various, phone calls and email inquiries, which sort of was really, educational for us in understanding how folks are using PNBOT and what issues might not be super self-explanatory that might also potentially cause major issues. So I want you all to be able to learn from other people's issues and learn it the easy way rather than the hard way. So here's sort of a cheat sheet of some of the major ones to keep in mind. So first of all, we definitely recommend that you use PNBot version 1.1. 1.0 was released back in July, but then we actually fixed a number of bugs and other issues and tried to make things a little bit more user-friendly and added a couple features in version 1.1 that was released in August. If you're not sure which version you're using, just take a look at the home screen, and in the home sheet of your PNBot copy, the easiest visual thing to look for to know what version you're using is there's a section that says look at raw data, and there should be 5 buttons there instead of 4. Okay, and another major recommendation is to test out PNBot in a separate copy of PNBot just with a small number of entries before you sort of go crazy entering a lot of information. That way you can catch any issues, whether it's a training issue or it's a technical issue, before you waste a lot of time entering data in case you have to re-enter it. You don't want to find out, after entering 80 patients that, you have been neglecting something that you just didn't know about, or if for some reason PNBot wasn't compatible with your setting. So just with a few, maybe like 5 to 10 entries, try it out with each level of data and go through the entire gamut. So basically, look at things from the data entry sheet, through the list sheet, through the reports. Definitely run some reports to make sure that you're seeing the numbers you're expecting before proceeding with sort of real data entry. Again, always use the data entry sheets for entering all data. Immediately enter a patient and case record together at the same time, and make sure that each patient has one and only one patient record in the system and at least one case record in the system. There's a video online about 3 important types of saves, so I highly recommend that you check that out. Saving the file, pressing the gray save buttons on the data entry sheets, and also making sure there's another specific type of save for the barriers and actions table in the encounters data entry sheet that I want you to be aware of. So definitely check out that video. The last thing we want is for you to lose your data, so it's definitely worth your while. And I also recommend that you make regular backup copies of PNBot. So I'm actually going to share my screen again because I set it up here on this computer just to provide an example. So if you end up using PNBot for like a whole year, let's say, it would be awful if, somebody accidentally deleted everything or corrupted PNBot in some way and you just lost a year's worth of data. So to avoid that, it's a great idea to keep multiple copies of PNBot on a regular basis. So here, what I did is I started a folder called PNBot Database, and I started a folder called Archive, where I periodically saved copies of PNBot that are clearly dated so that I know, this is what my data look like in July, August, September, so that, I have my current copy of PNBot that I'm using, and it's super important to be clear about which copy that is so that you don't accidentally enter into the wrong copy. But then if something happens to it, maybe I'll lose like a couple days worth of data instead of, all my data. So highly recommend that as well. And also, just to go back to the slide, because I realize that the presentations, when I share my screen, don't forget to delete the 2 example entries in the list sheets before generating reports, but also be a little bit conservative about when you delete them. So try to keep them in there as long as possible and enter at least 2 of your own entries into that same list sheet before deleting them. And one other thing I want to make you aware of is, unfortunately, if you do encounter a Microsoft Visual Basic error message that looks like this, that has a button on it that says debug and end and whatnot, that means that something happened with the programming. If you see one, just save PNBot, close out of it and restart it. Don't try to, just keep powering through and using it. Otherwise, you might see some glitchy things. And you might, mess up your data, and you don't want to do that. So just restart it, and 99% of the time that should fix the issue, and you could proceed with using PNBot. And also, lastly, Encounters data entry sheet has a lot of heavy lifting going on, so make sure you understand the quirks. There's another video on our website that that gives you a pretty thorough tutorial about how to enter and use that sheet in general. So I recommend that you check that out. And that's basically it.
Serena, actually, can I
Sure.
briefly ask us to address one other question that came up with is, can people customize their own list of barriers, and what workarounds exist if they're not able to? So if you want to address the first part of it,
sure.
I'd be glad to address the second part.
Okay, sure. So that's a great question. You cannot change the list of barriers that's in PNBot, but hopefully the list in there is comprehensive enough. Just to show you what it looks like, I'm going to share my screen again. But, okay. So there's a tab here called Reference that actually has the entire list of all the barriers that you might encounter. So it's pretty comprehensive. So we're hoping that you won't need to customize it, but if you did want to, you unfortunately would not be able to make up your own barriers. On the other hand, one thing you could do instead is you could, find a close match and then write notes for yourself over here and write the details so that, it makes sense for you and, is specific enough for your needs.
That's exactly right. Another example I was going to offer, the person who asked the question about demographic concordance between the patient and the navigator. So the example here are breast patients being navigated by male volunteer navigators because they're trying to better understand if discordance is a barrier to care. They could actually create a custom variable in the patient data entry for navigators' gender, and then they could develop their own pivot tables later where they were able to sort of track those relationships, also looking at the notes field. So I was just thinking that that might be another workaround in addition to the notes fields that you specified.
Yeah, definitely. So that's definitely something you can do as well if you're interested in looking at the gender. You can specify that. I guess you'd have to think through where it would make the most sense to put it. One thing I do want to note is that for the reports, whether it's an automatic report or a pivot report, you can only ever compare variables at the same level. So if you're wondering about breast cancer patients, cancer type is a case level variable, so you might want to note the navigator's gender at the case level so that you can sort of cross tab those two variables. That's a great question. And I realize we're over time, so unless there's anything else pressing, I'd just like to wrap up and thank you all for joining us and for your patience. Apologies for going over a little bit. I'd like to acknowledge that this work was supported by a grant from Genentech, and we also want to thank a lot of navigators out there who have contributed with awesome feedback and insights in shaping the direction of the PNBot tool. And we thank you for joining, and keep an eye out for the quick start guide that we'll be sending out in a follow-up email. We do have an evaluation survey that we'd love for you to take. It's going to open as soon as I end this meeting, and we wish you all the best with using PNBot. Thanks for joining us.